a wonderful team to work with, and someone who is invested in improving in learning outcome of students in UAE and GCC. Over to you, Savitri.
Thank you, Kushark. Ladies and gentlemen, once more, a very warm welcome to all of you on this esteemed panel discussion on giftedness and talent development in schools. It's an honor to have such distinguished guests and experts gathered here today to shed light on this crucial topic. While nurturing all the young minds in our care, we must recognize and support gifted students' unique abilities and potential. So today we've gathered to explore the challenges and opportunities in fostering their talents within our educational systems. So we at SAGE and EI and our partner organization GenWise have worked vigorously to identify and nurture gifted students. EI, SAGE and GenWise are committed to facilitating and enabling schools on the same. In pursuit of this goal, our team of experts will be visiting Dubai between 7th and 12th of December. So should any of the schools represented here want to know more about the possibilities, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I will be sharing my email on chat. I hope to hear from many of you. And now it's my privilege to introduce the moderator of the panel discussion, Mr. Vishnu Agnihotri. Vishnu is the co-founder of GenWise, an organization known for its expertise in gifted programs that support both academic enrichment and socio-emotional development. Vishnu has been the academic director of more than 10 gifted residential programs since 2016. He believes gifted students should be nurtured as versatilists, people with depth in one or two fields and breadth across a wide swathe of areas. More to hear from him. He has spoken about GenWise's curriculum to nurture such individuals at international conferences of UNESCO and the National Association of Gifted Children, NAGC, USA. Before GenWise, Vishnu was Vice President Assessments at Educational Initiatives. He has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from IIT Madras with over 30 years of national and international experience, more than half of which is in the field of school education. Before I hand over the mic to Vishnu, a couple of requests of the audience here. If you can put down your name in your in the Zoom, so that we can identify who have registered and who have actually attended. That would be a very big help for our logistics team. Thank you so much. Over to you, Vishnu.
Yeah, thank you, Savitri. Kushark, maybe we can stop the screen share. Yeah, thank you. So it's a pleasure of mine to be moderating this panel, and I'm going to just start by introducing Susan and Steve. But just before that, I'm very pleased with the mix of the panel and the audience in this conversation for a couple of reasons. We seem to have a good mix of people with different backgrounds as well as from different geographies. Susan has a lot of expertise as a gifted education researcher and a lot of expertise in running out of school programs at the Evanston campus of Northwestern University near Chicago. She's done that for a lot of years. And Steve, in contrast, is a dyed-in-the-blood teacher, head teacher, school administrator, so handling very different kind of complexities, a wide range of children, and trying to include everyone at all ends of the performance curve. So that is one. So we have a healthy mix of different dimensions and different areas of giftedness. And in terms of geography also, I was just going through the globe from west to east, and we have the US, we have UK. Steve has worked in the UK for a long time. And then we have the Middle East, we have Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and then we have me from India, and Steve comes in again from Australia. So we are covering quite a wide sort of range of the planet. So let me, I'm going to refer to some of my notes because while I know Susan fairly well, this is the first time I'm meeting Steve. So I'm just going to refer to my notes while I introduce both of them. So Dr. Susan Corwith is the director of the Center for Talent Development at Northwestern University. The Center for Talent Development falls under the School of Education and Social Policy. And Susan is also an assistant professor in the school. Dr. Corwith's expertise is in the fields of gifted education and talented development, with an emphasis on the design, development, and evaluation of academic enrichment and acceleration programs. She has written extensively about high-quality, inclusive programs and services that foster talent development, and has authored numerous articles and chapters on gifted programming standards, academic acceleration, and assessment and identification. I have personally learned a lot reading the literature produced by Susan and her colleagues, Eric, and the previous director of Center for Talent Development, Dr. Paula Olszewski-Kubilius. So a lot of great literature out from CTD. Susan is also part of many advocacy efforts for the cause of gifted education, and she's also currently the president of the Illinois Association for Gifted Children. She received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in educational leadership and policy analysis, with an emphasis on high-quality programs and curriculum for advanced learners. So Steve, I come to Steve now, and Steve Arnold is the head of Gifted and Talented at GEMS Education, a position he has taken up in the last few weeks, perhaps barely a month. He was born and raised in rural Australia, started his career as a teacher there. He moved to the UK after a few years and worked with multiple schools in both England and Scotland. In between being in Australia and moving to the UK, he embarked on a 7-month backpacking trip that took him from Singapore through to Nepal, culminating in a trek to the Mount Everest base camp. At Hampton School in London, he led the curriculum and assessment initiatives in a highly academic environment, giving him insight into what is needed to support high achievers, not just in academics, but across the spectrum. After this, he was linked head teacher of 3 schools in Orkney, Scotland. Steve worked on changes to both culture and standards to improve academic performance as well as general well-being. From here, Steve went on to become the lead on inclusion, including the socio-emotional needs of all children, safeguarding and well-being at a local authority level, which was supporting 26 educational settings. And this included developing the gifted and talented provision. So the flow of our panel discussion today is going to be like this. I'm going to first 20 or 30 minutes. I will request Susan and Steve to share a little bit more about their backgrounds, their work, how they got into gifted and talented the space, what are, and some introductory ideas, because not all of us are familiar with this, and the terms are also used differently. So for 20 to 30 minutes, we'll do some basic work to understand both of them as well as the space. After that, I will ask a few key questions. Many of you have asked questions while you were registering. So we'll spend another 20-25 minutes on that. And after that, we'll open it up to the floor. You can keep asking questions as we go along, and we will take some of them. And if we cannot take all of them, we will certainly write to you or meet you sometime to respond to those questions. So with that, we will get started. I'm going to ask Susan to start off, and Steve to respond to the same question after that. So Susan, you've spent a lot of time in this space, and I've spent 7-8 years in this field, and I still find that there are many different views on what giftedness is, what talent is, and do these words mean the same thing? Are they different things? So please tell us a little bit about what these terms mean to you and to the Center for Talent Development, and what broadly does CTD do and offer?
Thank you, Vishnu. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's really great to be here with you and with everyone here today, and to be on a panel with Steve. And I think we'll bring very complementary experiences and perspectives to this. And we could spend probably hours just talking about giftedness and talent development and defining those different pieces, because what is exciting about being in the research work is that we've kind of explored different avenues, and there are several different sort of theories or conceptions of giftedness and talent development that have emerged. And I think when we hear the term gifted, that has to be explored a little bit and unpacked in different ways. There is no sort of single definition of what giftedness is, but if you are involved at all with the National Association for Gifted Children, which I know you have familiarity with, and that our center works very closely with, or the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children, sort of two agencies that work in this arena, they've sort of defined giftedness as, you know, sort of developmental in nature, that there's general ability, certainly, and that's something that we pay attention to, but that there is also a lot that we can do to help young people identify their interests and areas of strength and to nurture that. So I guess there's more a traditional approach to giftedness, where we think more specifically about generalized ability, about assessments, perhaps IQ scores, things like that. Whereas in other frameworks and at the Center for Talent Development, our philosophy or our framework is right in our name, the talent development piece, which is really kind of the research around how do we recognize from a very young age where people's interests and strengths are, and how then we can design learning environments and opportunities for students to develop that, to really nurture that. And that there are stages of development, and we can affect how people grow and develop in different ways, which brings me to what we do at the Center for Talent Development, which is both direct service to students and service to parents and educators. So on the student side, you know, if you're exploring our website at all, or kind of looking at what we do, or in collaboration with you and others, is enrichment and sort of accelerated credit-bearing courses for students from as young as early childhood, age 4, with their families, through high school. So they may come and explore a wide range of topics, and our goal is to have them find something that they feel interested in and good at, and to really dive into that deeply and give them experiences in the summer and weekends and to do that. But when we're working with schools and educators, it's how do you design programs? How do you look at the resources and expertise that you have and really attach that to what we know about how children develop, how ability manifests, and make sure that there are services in place. So professional learning, program reviews, design, consulting, those kinds of things. And with parents, we're actually running a course for parents right now, educating them about these different ways of thinking about giftedness and ability, and how to nurture that and work with their school to support that.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So what I'm hearing is that giftedness is a little more towards abilities, maybe, you know, little more innate abilities, and talent development is more about stages of translating that into achievement. Is that correct? Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have to sort of boil it down, there is, you know, when we think about gifting, there is sort of a measure of ability, but with talent development, we think about it in specific domains. And what we've learned is that, yes, we can have general ability, and as young children, that's sort of where we start. But as we get older and mature and go through different stages of life, we can, you know, be more domain specific. You may see people who gravitate toward, you know, math or sciences, or, you know, sort of visual arts, or different, you know, different domains, specific domains of talent that we can impact.
Right, right. So giftedness has more a general ability connotation, and talent development is more about yeah, taking a specific domain and really developing expertise in that. Okay, thanks for that. So Steve, I would like you to comment on some of these, and I have a question before that. If I am not mistaken, the gifted and talented practice in GEMS education comes under the Child Services Division. Is that correct? So I'm curious as to what Child Services is about and how does Gifted and Talented fit into Child Services. It would be useful for all of us to understand that, because I'm not so certain, at least in India, I have not come across a Child Services division of a school. So I'm curious about that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really good place to start, actually, because it fits in with really why I'm here and how it relates to my experience. So we have now a newly established children's services team, as you describe, and if you were to rebadge it or rename it, you might call it the inclusion team. So the children's services team is made up of safeguarding, inclusion, well-being, EAL, and gifted and talented, and it all fits under that sort of inclusion umbrella. So really we're looking at those elements of school life. And I think from a school's perspective, gifted and talented fits right there. And that certainly was my experience when I was leading on inclusion at a local authority level in the UK, is I felt gifted and talented really did belong under that inclusion umbrella, because what we're talking about is meeting the needs of all children. And the fundamental principle of planning and provision for a gifted or a talented child is really the same as planning for a child with special educational needs, for example. In fact, the two can be occurring concurrently. And it's all about planning for the individual and having effective methods of planning and implementation, and making sure that the core focus of the school is on meeting the needs of all learners. And gifted and talented is really no different to that. And you touched upon this earlier in your introduction. I'm really glad you did, about how, when we see children with barriers perhaps to engagement, or we see children that aren't necessarily, we perhaps identify that there might be gifts there, but then their progress against the curriculum or their attainment isn't where we would expect, then quite often coming alongside these gifts are these barriers to access, because the needs are different and the engagement is different. And part of the reason why we sometimes see these barriers is a lack of confidence. Just like we see with special educational needs, we see a lack of confidence in day-to-day practitioners in terms of catering for these children that have been identified as being gifted or talented. Because for most classroom teachers, that won't necessarily be their background. And the immediate assumption is, as a teacher, as an educator, if I'm responsible for this gifted or talented pupil, I need to know more. I need to be an expert. And that comes with a level of perhaps threat or that lack of confidence. And what I'm really passionate about is actually the beauty of and I'd be really interested to hear actually Susan's opinion on this, because from my experience and where my passion lies is the beauty of catering for gifted and talented children is actually, it's more about removing barriers than providing them with information and knowledge. And as an educator, there's nothing better than being that role of that activator. Some might call it a facilitator. I like to call it an activator, where actually what you're doing is creating that environment. I always think about, I don't know if people in the chat will be familiar with Renzulli's 3-ringed model of giftedness. Well, that always comes into my mind when I think about classroom provision. If you can create the conditions where you can have the child with the above average ability, the ability to be committed to a task, and that ability to be innovative and creative with the knowledge application, then that's where that day-to-day provision, and that's where those needs are then being met. And that really is my passion.
Thank you, Steve. I think I really like 2 things you said. One was that at the core of it, it's about meeting the needs of all children. And if you could really do that, we need not even talk about a separate gifted program, right? In an ideal world. But it's really about meeting the needs of all children. And the other thing I really liked was what you said about removing barriers. So a question to you and to Susan, and maybe Steve, you should go first. So in your experience, when you've been trying to do this with schools in the UK and working with those people in the local authority, so what are some of these needs which perhaps go unnoticed and which teachers lack the confidence to engage with? So if you can tell us a little bit about what are these needs of some of those gifted and talented children, because sometimes we tend to think that they can take care of themselves. So we're quite curious to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, it really is specific. It's hard to generalize in terms of the needs because it really is specific to the individual. But what tends to be perhaps what you might classify as a bit of a vicious circle that you can get into is that if you have a gifted child or a really able child who may have really specific strengths and talents and gifts in a certain area, and they're not being able to demonstrate those or to apply those, what can happen is that lack of engagement, and that lack of engagement can then be interpreted by the teacher as poor behavior, and what can sometimes happen if you're not really careful with your identification and then really have a really strong shared understanding of what good provision looks like, and the ability to be a reflective practitioner, to move beyond he's a daydreamer, she just stares out the window all day, she's non-compliant, all of these sorts of things, to move beyond that and actually look at, well, what are the reasons behind that? Because so often I've had conversations as a principal, as in the local authority and in this current job now, where I've spoken to classroom teachers and I'll be able to point to data or point to evidence which would suggest this child has gifts or talents identified through assessments, and they say, yes, but I don't see that in the classroom because he doesn't listen, because his standard of writing is, he doesn't take pride in his work, there's no effort, he doesn't work well with others, I'm just generalizing here, and quite often it's because that level of engagement isn't there and the frustration builds as a result. And it's not just a barrier then to provision, it becomes a barrier to that child recognizing that they have gifts and talents. And that's one of the most crucial things. We want children to quite quickly develop this sense of self, sense of their own strengths, sense of their own ways of working, because the benefits of that are not just to do with academic development or talent development or skills. It's got to do with this well-being, and well-being and gifted and talented. I hope we get a chance to talk about that later on because it's such a crucial issue. But if we can build this sense that in children that actually, perhaps the reason why you're finding these things difficult is because your strengths are on this side, and we should amplify the opportunities for you to demonstrate and experience those strengths, and we should amplify the opportunities that you get. And as I said, when we miss that opportunity and therefore engagement suffers as a result, sometimes that becomes a barrier because teachers can make an assumption that actually, they're not particularly interested or they're not particularly engaged.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that was quite instructive. Susan, if you could add a bit to this piece of what is it, that goes unnoticed, or what is it that schools find difficult to address?
Sure. And sometimes it is understanding what's happening behind the scenes, as Steve was articulating quite well, because there really are kind of a couple of pieces to what we know about, giftedness and talent development. And the one side is sort of that in a school, in the academic areas, sort of an ability to process information sometimes quickly, or in a different way than other students, their age and experience. So you may be looking at a need for faster pacing or higher level content, or a way to bring complexity into what they're doing, in a way to apply that in different ways. But that's the academic side. And I think Steve was starting to hit on something very important about the well-being, and tied to talent development is this really important aspect of psychosocial skill development. And there are a whole range of pieces within that, but simply to say there are elements where a student does need the right level of challenge and the right level of engagement, and the opportunity to be mentored and to work with peers, because they have to encounter places where they have to work hard, where they have to develop the skills that they need to problem solve, to deal with things that don't work out quite right, to figure out how to organize themselves. And when the learning environment is not sort of engaging them or sort of meeting them at their level, they're not necessarily developing their skills, and they're sort of getting this misrepresentation of what learning really is, or how they function as learners. And I think we have to be really thoughtful about that. And that can be difficult for schools to figure out. Sometimes the assessments we have, or the tools that we have as educators, and we talk with educators a lot about this, aren't giving the full picture of a student's readiness to learn, or kind of where they are in their learning. And I think that's where we talk about, well, what kind of grade level assessments are you using? What kinds of above grade level assessments are there? And it's not always about formal assessments, but how are the opportunities, the activities being put in front of students? Are they having opportunities to ask questions and sort of dive in, work with other students, and show you how they're thinking, or what they know and can do, and maybe where those strength areas are, and where those areas are that they might be having more difficulty, or where there may need to be supports in place. Because I think Steve made a really good point about the fact that some students have very high levels of ability in a certain area, but they are having more difficulty and not quite meeting grade level standards in another area. That can happen.
Yeah. So what I'm taking away from both your comments is that, so if you use the metaphor of the iceberg, so what we tend to see is the non-compliant behavior, or the daydreamer, or the slow student who's not doing so well in math or some other subject. And the typical response is to, okay, let's give remedial classes, or do this or that. And sometimes these things work, but it appears that there is something which is, below the surface, which first, we need to have a paradigm. We need to even realize that there is something below the surface that we need to look at. And even if we realize that there could be something below the surface, we may not have the tools or skills like these assessments or other things. So it's quite fascinating. And I'm intrigued, Steve, by you talking about well-being and giftedness. And so can you elaborate about this whole well-being piece and how you see all these things connected?
Yeah, I think there's a number of layers to it. I don't like relying on anecdotes, but I think this anecdote does give an example of what we've just spoken about in terms of potential barriers, and it also speaks to the well-being side of things. I was in a school not so long ago. I'm not even going to mention the country the school was in. I'll just say it's a school, and a very good school, by the way, really good provision. But I was speaking to the person who was leading on Gifted and Talented at that particular school. And I was looking at the journey of the children that had been identified as gifted and talented. And so I was sort of looking at the data, visiting classrooms, speaking to them, and then looking at outcomes at them. And so looking at that whole sort of journey. And there was one pupil who'd been identified as gifted. And I was in the classroom, and the Gifted and Talented coordinator said to me, well, this young person, scores really highly on the cognitive abilities tests, has off the charts and was achieving really well. But we've actually taken this child off the gifted list because they're really not paying attention. They're not putting pride in the work, and they haven't been performing against the curriculum. And I sort of stopped. I thought, how do I approach this? Because we were in the classroom, and so I waited till around. I said, so conceptually, can we say that a child was identified as gifted, but now because of the way they're presenting in the classroom, our conclusion is that they're not gifted anymore. Once a child has been identified and has demonstrated those gifts, you know, surely it's not right that we then classify them differently. And there are two things to that. The first thing is that when the engagement and the attainment and the progress became an issue, the school's first port of call, instead of saying, what are we doing and what can we do for this young person, it was, well, they're not gifted anymore, or they're not trying anymore. And the second thing is, immediately to me, that would ring the alarm bells of well-being. What is happening to this young person? It just so happened that they were in their adolescence, when we know there's all sorts of cognitive changes, physical changes. We know that there's also potentially lots of things going on in their wider life. Has anybody asked the question in terms of why has engagement dropped? Why has enjoyment, why has satisfaction fallen away? Why are we seeing these sort of behaviors? And I think that there's potentially, with gifted and talented children, there's the potential actually that we see an even more dramatic change in that level of well-being to do with related to education than we do in others, because the risk is higher that they perhaps drift, and they're not experiencing that level of challenge, and therefore engagement drops. There's also the risk, and this can vary in context. There's also the risk that actually the pressure on them, or the perceived pressure on them, has increased, and as a response to that, there can be a resistance, particularly as they grow weary of it. We have to be so cautious as schools if we're going to share an identification of a child being gifted and talented with the family, which if we're confident in doing so, absolutely we should be doing. But we need to be so cautious that that comes with the ability to build a shared understanding with the family of what that means and what that looks like for that child or young person. And what it shouldn't look like is that the blinkers come on, exactly to Susan's point before, and we just focus them on this narrow band of talent they may have at the exclusion of everything else they need to develop. And it also shouldn't mean that it's more, and that there's that sort of that desire to push from behind rather than clear the path in front. And it's really important that as schools, we're able to build that understanding with families, and then together monitor the well-being really carefully.
Your anecdote is quite instructive to me. So what I'm hearing you and Susan saying is, while we have looked at the child through the lens of this, how well they are doing on this particular trait, the child is still a child, an adolescent, a member of a family with peers. And the child has needs as a whole child, as an individual. And we cannot disregard that and only look at this piece that, okay, it's gifted in math, so they therefore should be doing very well in this. So that's quite a challenge for educators in schools to sort of, sometimes see the tree and sometimes see the forest and see the whole child, see that ability, and to be able to keep shifting between these levels. It's not a trivial task. So my question to both of you, so maybe Susan, you can talk about this from the perspective of the work you do with educators in schools, and I understand that you are supporting some schools in this, and Steve, you've been on the field with your hands in classrooms. So what I'm curious about is, so let us say a school or a school system, like say the 40-odd GEM schools, or somebody who's heading a cluster of schools, or even one school, if they really want to meet the needs of these gifted and talented students, what are the sort of areas of knowledge that different people in the school need to have? So for example, what is it that teachers need to know? what is it that, the school counselor needs to know? What is it that the school head needs to know? What is it that the school board needs to appreciate? So it would be good if, you can spend a few minutes in talking about this. And most of the audience today are school heads, right? So there are probably about 3-4 people from each school. Yeah, thank you. Susan, would you like to, go first?
Sure. Yeah. It's a really good question, and it is contextual. Each school system and environment community is a little bit different. But I think when we talk with schools and work with educators and administrators, we're starting with kind of what is your mission as a school? What's your philosophy? Sort of where are you coming from? And then to have that conversation about, well, giftedness and talent development, and how is that defined? Is everybody using the same terminology, coming from the same point of view, seeing this as a continuum of needs that exist in your school? And I really like, Steve was talking about where gifted and talented education fits within GEMS, and it's kind of part of that, whole student service, because it is a continuum of needs. But schools haven't always, or administrators and educators haven't always had that conversation and really put it in the picture of everything we do as a school. How does this work? And then to have that communication with parents and with the students themselves. So we're kind of all on that same page. So that's a starting place. The next thing we have conversations with educators and administrators about is, do you know truly the full range of abilities and needs of your students? And how do you get to that information if you don't feel like you have that information? For us, when we're doing program design or program review, that may be time with different stakeholder groups, meeting with parents, meeting with educators, meeting with students. It may be some surveys, it may be assessment data, materials on a website, sort of taking a look at what's the story here, and what are the understandings, what are the resources that we have, and where are sort of the needs that exist, and then can we allocate those resources. For us, classroom educators, it's very important to sort of understand what or how giftedness can manifest in different domains, but also just on sort of how things work in our school is, how do we identify? How do we refer for service? Who are the people that parents can go to if it's not the classroom educator? Sort of what is the scope of the responsibility of the teacher? That's something they need to know. They need, we talk a lot about instructional approaches and differentiation, and to what extent that can happen and how that can happen effectively. For administrators, it's how do you remove some of those barriers that might be there if a student does need to accelerate, or if a student does need support from a mentor, or does need both, special education services as they may be defined, as well as other forms of service. How do you put those pieces together? So I think it's different layers, sort of depending on who your school population includes, and sort of the resources that you have available to you.
Thanks, Susan. Steve, would you like to add to that? What do you see the knowledge and training needs of different stakeholders in the school?
I think I completely concur with what Susan was saying there about the structure and making sure you've got that framework built around your gifted and talented provision to make sure there's a clear pathway. But I'm glad that we're talking about classroom practice specifically, because I think sometimes what we can get perhaps confused by in terms of gifted and talented provision is what I like to call the bells and whistles, which, by the way, have their place. So it's when you get an astronaut come in and speak to the kids, or when you get a general knowledge quiz and an event for the kids to go to, or it could be all those sort of events and big sporting occasions and visits and the things that look fantastic when they're publicized, which have their place, because that's where you get that exposure and that opportunity for children to experience those areas which they might then have proficiency within, or they might develop talents within. But what actually has the impact is what happens every day, and in by extension every lesson. And that's maybe what we don't focus on enough, is actually, Susan used the word differentiation. That's absolutely right. That to make sure that we've got that individual planning within lessons to make sure there's stretch and challenge. And as I said, that can feel like a level of threat, because for some it will mean I have to have deeper subject knowledge. I have to be able to extend. And subject knowledge, particularly in some curriculums, for example, the Indian curriculum is content rich and fast paced, and so you've got that need, that requirement to move things through, and extension at times does look like, okay, extending to the next area. But actually, in my opinion, and perhaps Susan will be able to tell me whether this is backed up by research or not, it is the rich learning, it is the deeper learning, it is the application of skills and knowledge, and the opportunity to be innovative and creative with that skills and knowledge, that where in my mind that gold really lies in terms of enrichment and extension and deeper understanding. And actually, the ability for classroom teachers to do that is less constrained than if they're having to find more resource and more subject knowledge and things like that, because it just requires a shift in thinking. I saw this, and questioning, by the way, is a huge part of that. If you can develop within classroom practitioners this bank of questioning for, higher order thinking, and allow them to plan for that, but also to be responsive. And there are little tricks. I saw this excellent thing in a lesson just yesterday where a maths teacher was talking to a gifted child about an equation. And just as he was finished, and I thought he was about to walk away, he turned around and said, "Oh, by the way, what do you think is the most common incorrect answer to that equation?" And that was like, that just showed that ability to understand how one question can actually be 15 minutes of really in-depth analysis and thought. And it seems, that's just a simple trick. But if people, it's Bloom's taxonomy. If people understand how these things relate and can plan for it, then that really shifts the thinking within the classroom. And as I said, innovation and creativity, and building strategies within your school for teachers to access that is really important.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I agree with many of your points. So it is classroom which happens every day, and you talked about how the shift in perspective, questioning more of rich activities rather than, say, doing calculus earlier, or what comes one grade later, perhaps has more impact on children. And it would be, if Susan is aware of any research on that, she should tell us about that. I know that the Center for Talent Development offers a lot of enrichment courses as well as the advanced placement kind of courses. I have a slightly longer question, and I would like both of you to take some time to address this. So at my organization, we've been running a lot of dedicated gifted programs. These are primarily out-of-school experiences, whether these are residential gifted programs like the one CTD and others conduct, or online live courses and so on. And it is relatively easier to do this because you have this, a simple environment where all the kids are interested in a particular thing. They've chosen that course. They don't go back home and stuff like that. While in principle, I think doing something in school every day would add a lot of value. And I think both are complementary. Like you said, you get the astronaut, you send the child to the gifted program. But both these pieces are important. But it seems to me that the school piece is sort of more challenging, because the school is handling so many different things on a day-to-day basis. So my question to both of you is, what can a school do? And if there are some examples, even if there are small interventions, because I've met a lot of schools and they're struggling with this. We speak of differentiation, but then my experience has been that it's not very easy to facilitate a differentiated classroom or even to get the resources for that. So I'm curious to hear some examples and some ideas of what is really possible within school. Susan, would you like to take that first?
Sure. And I guess, I'll start with sort of the idea that we were getting to about enrichment and sort of depth and complexity and acceleration. That's not really an either or, it's a both. And sort of as we've been talking about identifying where students' needs really are and how then we respond to that. Because, Steve started to get into what I really like, and we talk a lot with educators about, which is sort of that questioning and sort of conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, factual knowledge, and how do we kind of work within those different arenas and pull them together to support students, because they do need to be able to think with complexity and ask good questions and problem solve. And at the same time, there are also students who move through content at a deep level at a fast pace. And so we do have to think about at what point that's appropriate. And then from a school point of view, at our center, and when we're working with others in the field, we're talking about a continuum of services with schools and school districts. Now, in the United States, we're talking a lot about multi-tiered systems of support, and the idea that there's sort of tiers of service, levels of intervention that a student might need, both from a special education point of view as defined in the US and elsewhere, I know around the world. And the same thing with gifted education services, that there are some things that can happen in a classroom, and that a teacher in that classroom with the proper supports, whether that means an opportunity to work with colleagues and do some co-teaching, to have a specialist or a coach in the building who is helping to design lessons or to come in and support that, or that there may be an aide that's there, or a way to have students work in groups or centers that support the activity and the differentiation that can go on in a classroom. But not every student can be served by that classroom teacher. And so what does the school have in their sort of practice, their continuum of services that would be a more intensive intervention? Does that student need a targeted pullout to work with someone in math or science in a particular unit or throughout the year? Is that student so far ahead that we may need to consider moving them to a different grade level or working with a different classroom of students? So I think that's when we talk with schools about what they can do, they can't be everything to all students all the time, but they can build relationships and partnerships and provide services to parents or direct parents to places where the students can get what they need. And so I think, Vishnu, when you were talking about the services that you provide and the programs that we provide at the center, they are sometimes in cooperation with schools. So we will be doing joint programming to extend what the school can offer, because our expertise complements what they do. Or to be able to say to a family, hey, talent development is a lifespan proposition. It doesn't just happen sort of in the school, in that school time. When we think about Olympic sports, when we think about music or art, we often think outside of the school building. The same thing happens in a variety of domains, that we need time to explore with other people who share those similar interests or have the same level of experience or ability, to work with mentors who have expertise in that particular area, who may be able to speak to a pathway toward adulthood and what this might look like in a career or profession. So I'm speaking at sort of in the big picture of the planning of the range of services that a school might provide, along with the idea that talent development takes place both inside and outside of school. And there are ways to support that at home and through the educators at the school.
Right. Steve, you have any thoughts to share on this? There are also a couple of questions in the chat related to what we were just speaking about. So Srividya has asked whether there are tasks in the class can you just give different work to these gifted and talented students while other things are happening in the classroom? So she's talking about the differentiated classroom. And Roshni D'Souza has asked that there are schools where separate classes are set up only for the gifted and talented students. Do you think that's a good idea? Of course, it doesn't have to be either or. So any comments on that, Steve?
Yeah, that last question about, do you have a gifted and talented group? Do you want to group children in terms of ability? Do you want mixed ability groups? Yeah, I mean, if Susan has an answer to that, I'd really like to hear it, because I wrestle with this quite often, because on the one hand, I'm a huge believer in the value of mixed ability groupings and those really rich, and that was certainly my background as an educator for most of the time. However, when I was deputy head academic at Hampton School, which is an academically selective, independent school in London, so we had really high achieving children, then we did stream in terms of ability. And I mean, it's a really interesting compromise. For your gifted and talented children, you can certainly see the value in it. However, there are enrichment opportunities for all that come from mixed ability groups. And I'm not sure there's one right answer. I've seen some really great extension tasks which involve highly able pupils providing examples or working in conjunction with other children, and obviously the benefit then for the other children in terms of inspiration, ideas, and whatever else. And again, that idea of confidence and self-esteem for the most able. There are all sorts of benefits that come along with that. There's also a capacity issue. Many of you will be sitting there going, well, we would love to have a gifted and talented group or an extra provision, but we don't have the resource, we don't have the capacity, and that is a universal obstacle, I think. So that's a really long-winded way of saying I don't know. I don't know what's best. I think probably it's completely contextual. Sometimes, depending on the groupings and depending on the experiences, it will be best to have a completely different task for your gifted and talented children. Sometimes it will actually be really good to have them working within the group and sort of differentiate by responding to what arises then. Because, Susan pointed out about how even though they might have these talents, they still need to learn how to work with other people. They still need to learn how to socialize. They still need to work out how to cooperate. So I'm not sure there's one answer to that question. I think the key, though, to all of this, and it might seem like a trite answer, but on a school level, is relationships. If you have a school and a context where relationships are prioritized and are fostered, and the culture is one of, we really know our children, we know our learners, we understand, then actually a lot of the problems that you describe in terms of extension and resource and capacity, they start to iron themselves out, because the staff then respond really quickly because they see things early and they change things early, and they're able to do that. It also, if you've got an environment, if you're sitting there thinking, well, in my school, we've got a bit of a capacity issue here and we're not sure what to do. Well, my advice there is give yourself a bit of license and give your staff a bit of license to try things, to try creative approaches, to try whether it's extracurricular activities targeted a certain area where you take those who have been identified as gifted and talented in a certain area and see where they go from there. Build up some strategies, run some CPD for your staff, start to change that ethos, because sometimes the worst thing you can do is have that paralysis of we don't know what to do next, where we feel stuck. And I'm really glad to hear that there are resources out there that schools can reach out to, because that's really important too.
Thanks, Steve. And I think your point about culture seems rather important to me. I personally align to what you're saying about sometimes have the mixed ability, sometimes put them in a peer group. And when you shared that anecdote about the gifted student in the conversation in the classroom, and he asked about, what do you think would be the common right answer or wrong answer to this question? The way I see it is one of the reasons schools should think about gifted and talented students and tailor their curriculum and classroom practice to that. It's not just for the sake of the gifted student, but I think it's a tide which raises all ships, right? Because suddenly, like, a lot more children are getting engaged, and it's a chicken and egg situation. Suddenly, you may find that because of bright and so on, is suddenly brimming with ideas and so good, and even gifts may reveal themselves in this kind of process. It says my internet connection is unstable. Can you all? Yeah, hopefully I'm good. So I'm going to. I think we'll slowly start moving towards the audience questions, and already there are some questions on chat. So there are two questions which seem to be asking the same thing.
Vishnu, before we do that, can I just do a follow-up to the question about
Yeah.
the
Please
structure?
go on.
Because it is a difficult thing, and we are talking about, services are kind of contextual, but I think there's one of the tensions I hear a lot in the conversations I have with educators is sort of this: can we, group students or have them in separate classrooms? And sometimes there's a concern about quality. And what I want to call out is to say that just because students are doing different tasks doesn't mean the quality of one is better than another. And if there is a quality issue, then that's a bigger problem that we need to address. Because just because students are doing something different or doing it in a different way, we're trying to respond to the needs that they've demonstrated. We're trying to match the instruction that they're ready for as much as possible, knowing that we can't, in a class perhaps of 30 students, you can't have 30 different things going on. But you can have a good sense of what each student may need and how we can then bring students together to meet those needs, meet them where they are. So I think we have to be thoughtful about that. And the research does bear out there are a lot of things we can do in a classroom, a mixed ability classroom, to allow students to be there together and to support a teacher in serving those students well. But there are some students who really are so far outside the norm or what the teacher is able to do in that setting that we have to think about something different. And that's where that continuum of services and sort of how we structure that and when students are all working together and when they may be working in different groups makes sense. So I think these are really important conversations to have and to think about why we are making the choices we're making for the types of services and how stuck a student may get on a particular pathway.
Right. So it's not just one service, and it's not just one kind of gifted student. So even within giftedness, there is a continuum. So we really need to have this array of services and see how to mix and match these things. And yes, of course, a lot of it is contextual as well. There are a couple of questions. So one was asked by GEMS Modern Academy. I don't know if they are in this meeting, and I hope I'm interpreting their question correctly. And there's one more question which has just come on chat, and I think they are sort of the same question from Rajeshri Tanpure. So the question from GEMS Modern Academy was, what is the onus on gifted children themselves to sort of take ownership for their own learning? So the way I interpret that is, do they take the ownership? Do they, seek support? And how much do they have to sort of, get into this? Yeah, can you please keep yourself on mute, and Lippy, can you help with muting someone if needed? And Rajeshri Tanpure asks, sorry, not Rajeshri Tanpure, it was Nasreen. So Nasreen asks, do you agree on the fact that giving gifted and talented students more autonomy and ownership by allowing them to plan and teach their own lessons would help? So yeah, so the question loosely is, how much can enabling self-learning or demanding responsibility for having provided resources and support, demanding them to take ownership of their learning, is that something which is recommended, possible, feasible? Yeah. So.
Would you like me to respond to that?
Yes, Steve, please go ahead. Yeah.
So I think it's something pupil voice. Pupil voice is absolutely vital when it comes to all provision and planning. Gifted and talented, absolutely. It's interesting that it's sort of been described as putting the onus or making them take responsibility for it. I think it's more about empowering the children and giving them the voice within their own provision and education. And I think allowing, there's so much rich learning but it does need to be scaffolded, but in teaching children to self-assess and reflect on their own learning and then set targets as they go forward. And if they have that really deep understanding in a certain area, they usually quite quickly adapt to be able to do that in terms of where they think they need to head next. And they're actually remarkably accurate, even at a young age, in terms of making those decisions and making really sound decisions about where they need to go next. But of course, it needs that scaffolding. I think it's also, again, I hate to keep beating this drum, but it's also absolutely vital on a well-being perspective. Is for these young people to feel like they have a voice in where their learning is going, and what their learning experiences are, and what their targets are that they're trying to reach, because it gives you a real insight in terms of how they're feeling about what they're learning, how engaged they are, how interested they actually are, whether or not burnout is starting to creep in. It's a really fascinating thing, but I think on two fronts, on the well-being front and the learning front, if you can give kids the skills to be able to reflect and assess and plan, then it's a hugely rich experience for them. It also is another way to perhaps take the pressure off class teachers who are feeling a little stretched in terms of the breadth that they have to cover in terms of individual planning, is to say, well, actually at a certain stage, you sort of become the facilitator and they can take the box seat in terms of that planning at times. There are still times where it needs plenty of guidance, and it needs, this idea that they end up planning their own lessons. Maybe. But again, the question of subject knowledge comes in there, because they can only know what they already know, and sometimes we need to be able to facilitate that. So I think, in essence, pupil voice is absolutely vital.
Thanks, Steve. Susan, would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, I agree with what Steve is saying about it's important for all of our students to really have that voice and have some ownership. And as we were talking about a little bit earlier, a 10-year-old is still a 10-year-old in many ways. And, so they can guide their own learning, they can set some goals, they can, have someone help, and they can take some ownership. But still, we can't expect that a student, just because they are an advanced learner, can guide their own instruction and sort of manage that whole scale, which is, I don't think, what's being suggested. But I think sometimes there's this approach of saying, well, this learner can work more independently, and maybe they can, but probably not all the time, and not to the extent that would keep them on their kind of growth trajectory and that well-being that Steve's been talking about.
Thanks, Susan. So we're going to open it up for question and answers now, and you can unmute yourself and switch on your video and ask your questions to the panel. So one thing I would like Susan and Steve to keep in mind is there have been a bunch of questions, at least 3 or 4 questions from people who registered, where they've asked, if you want to go about setting up an in-school gifted program, what is the kind of steps or roadmap we can look at? What could be steps 1, 2, 3? I understand it is contextual and it could be something. So just keep that in the back of your mind. We will prioritize the questions people ask. But if some of those questions are sort of related to that, you could expand on that. So anybody who has a question, please raise your hands, and or you could just switch on your video and go for it. Yeah. Oh, okay. Lippy says you should raise your hand first. Yeah. Okay. So Okay, so while people are still raising hands, I'm going to read out something in the chat if you've not yet. Right. Okay, there is a very specific question about what we can do for science educators. Maybe we'll come to that later if we have time. Right. Lippy herself had a question, and maybe you can address that till someone
I
asks
have
the
another
So
question,
Lippy,
Vishnu.
you have another question? So Lippy, why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, is giftedness same as a prodigy child? How close, how different, or does one lead into another? Is there a intersecting space between the two? Susan, would you like to take a...
Sure. It's sort of, as I was saying, different conceptions and different definitions sort of use different terminology, right? For me, in our talent development framework and philosophy, I would say that's sort of on the continuum. Like the range of needs can vary, just like we see it, in all kind of levels of ability. So when we think about sort of words like prodigy, highly gifted, things like that, yes, there are people who are very much on the measures that we have at the highest ends, sort of the most discrepant from sort of what we expect of someone's age and experience and background. And so, but what I tend to think about and we work with in the center is sort of then what does that mean in terms of their need for, educational environment, opportunities to work with others who have a similar ability, sort of what does their trajectory look like? How do we help them continue to sort of grow and advance? And along with that, are there other sort of those well-being factors in there too? How is this individual experiencing the world? What are their relationships like? How are they sort of fitting into the environment around them and being able to sort of be content and contribute positively, right? So I think, yeah, there is such a thing, and it's on sort of a continuum of ability and needs. So I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but that's
does give me perspective, yes.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
Susan. So I think Safa can go first, followed by Rinku Paul, and then we'll take up the question in the chat. So Safa, please go ahead and ask your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was really enlightening. My question is about twice exceptional children. So what are the strategies that would be appropriate to employ for these children who have an gifted characteristic, but who also have one or more kind of disabilities? And I'm specifically talking about learning disabilities, such as a cognitive impairment to an extent. Thank you.
Steve, you want to tackle that from your experience, and I can then sort of take it from a bigger point of view, or?
Yeah, I'm very happy to sort of to start on that. I mean, the first thing to say is it's not uncommon, and particularly, when we think about neurodivergent children and young people, particularly with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, we quite often see that particular condition can involve really specific strengths and areas of interest which result in enormous amounts of knowledge and understanding in a certain area. And certainly that's something that we experience or we see reasonably frequently. I don't know of any sort of set format or planning format for sort of catering for both, the two sides of the coin, so to speak, other than actually, if you have an individual learning plan, which you would expect to have on both accounts, then there's no reason why that can't include both scaffolding for support where it's required. So again, if I was to use an imaginary pupil that had perhaps difficulty with social communication, difficulty with verbal communication, perhaps, but also real strength with scientific knowledge and application, then you would just ensure that you have the strategies in place to support where it's required, and the opportunity then to utilize those strengths and to make the most of those strengths, and see if that area of strength can be applied in other areas. What's really important, though, is the balance aspect, because that particular young person would need to make sure that their experiences were balanced and they weren't just focusing on that narrow band of ability.
I
Susan, would you like to
absolutely
take
agree
on
with
from
that.
there? Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that because, you know, you are typically working on an individualized plan for a student in that case, and sort of thinking about what are the scaffolds to allow the student to then work in those, you know, those strength areas or those areas where they're demonstrating really advanced ability or knowledge or skill, so that we're not just focusing on where, you know, on one side or another. So how do we bring that together? And this is an area that's getting a lot more attention. There is quite a bit of good work and some resources that have come out of the Bell and Blank Center at the University of Iowa in the United States, where they've actually put together guidance materials for families and for educators to help support students. And I think this is something that around the world is becoming more of a conversation about how do we sort of individualize and think about the different scaffolds, and how do we bring educators within the system together to have that conversation about meeting students' needs.
Thanks, Susan. So Rinku, if you could go ahead and ask your question, please.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yeah. Yes, Rinku, go ahead.
Thank you. It's a lot of questions on the chat are my questions too, so I'll wait patiently for them to be answered. But if add to that another one, and perhaps any time in the session, if it's answered, it would be wonderful. Many a times through my interaction with the GNT students, when asked, a few of them actually said that they do not need or want any provision. Now, as a school, we do want to try our very best to provide the best provisions that we can, whether they are removing barriers, like Steve said, or to engage in special programs, mentorship projects, etc. But the students and in schools like ours, we have a lot of programs at different levels anyway, which they are all a part of. And we are now, of course, beginning to document them as well. But if a student does say that, and a GNT student who is self-aware, self-assuredly says that, how much is too much? How much of student voice should be respected when planning for GNT students? Because very often I've seen that they are also very aware of their own strengths and needs. Maybe not always, but mostly so. So I just wanted to know that what is that built-in flexibility that we should exercise in a good GNT program that is homebred?
Yeah, either of you can take it up, and I'm quite intrigued because children saying that they do not want this. It's not something I've come across very often. Yeah. So,
it's because they said that the school is already doing enough, and this is in specific to a student who has been consistently performing very highly in both co-curricular and academics and leadership. So we kind of been tracking her for the last 2-3 years. And yeah,
I've come across it before. I recognize what you're saying, and actually it's akin to the child who needs support and says that they don't want it. They don't want someone helping them all the time. The key is to find out why. The key is to work out why, and I think that response indicates where the need in terms of the effort with that child needs to go first, and that's to say, okay, I mean, the obvious thing to me is that they don't want to be seen as different. They don't want specialized provision anyway, because they don't want to be seen different from their peers. We know in adolescent years, teenage years, the importance of that view from their peers rises and rises and rises, and for some, the desire to be seen as different is quite a challenging thing, especially if they feel different, which quite often gifted children will feel different because they're thinking differently. because they're understanding the world around them differently, and they'll feel different, and therefore they don't want to amplify that difference or project that difference. So I think it's, first of all, the first avenue is to find out why. The second avenue is to really help that child understand why this is being proposed as an option from them, and what it might mean, and to try to flip that view of themselves into a positive thing. And again, if it's an older, I presume this is an older pupil, that the example is, you know, start to get them to come up with some ideas in terms of, well, how could we access this in a way that you're comfortable with? If you're not comfortable with the way that we've suggested it, how can we provide it in a way that maybe you're more comfortable with? I mean, if it's a flat out no, then I think, as I said, there's a well-being concern there, and the well-being concern is why.
Yeah, I think why is at the core of it. Susan, yeah, you were saying something.
Yeah, that's exactly where I would start too. It's often the why. And then the other piece I would add to that is sort of what does their achievement profile look like? You said, you know, in this case, each case is going to be a little different, but if the student is achieving at a level that does seem to match where their ability is, you know, how many things are they engaged in? Is it perhaps, and this gets to the what's happening behind the scenes, but perhaps there are so many things happening that there is a feeling that no additional intervention is needed because attentions are being put in a lot of different places, and that can feel a little overwhelming. But that comes back to that what's happening and sort of what's behind the scenes. So it's always, why are they saying that, and how can, and it's not always easy to get to that answer, but it can be very instructive and helpful in designing how we move forward.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
Steve
you.
and Susan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rinku, for that great question. So I have to do some time management now. I think we have 7 or 8 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions which still need to be answered. So we'll try and answer them. So one, there are a bunch of questions on assessments, on how do we go about assessing students. So there are formal assessments like EI's asset talent search, above level test. Someone has mentioned the cognitive ability test, the CAT4 using those scores. You mentioned IQ tests earlier in the conversation, Susan. So we'll come to the assessments, but maybe let's hear what Ashwati has to say, try to respond to her as well as the assessments question, and then hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes left to wrap up the session. It's a long conversation, and we'll be back again, I'm sure, in a couple of months. So it's not a conversation we can end in 90 minutes. So Ashwati, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Vishnu. I would like to know how we can integrate technology to cater to the diverse learning needs of GNT within the school curriculum. Is there any learning platforms, or, you know, are there any resources? Thank you.
Right. So Steve, Susan, if you have any thoughts on this.
I mean, the obvious thing in terms of the knowledge base is obviously the ability to have the world's knowledge at your fingertips, although you need to be very judicious in how you access it and how you use it. Technology has huge implications and possibilities as far as gifted and talented goes. I must admit, I am not yet as familiar as I should be about specific gifted and talented technology-based resources that can be used. What I do know, though, however, you know, technology has opened up a whole new area of gifted and talented identification that perhaps was hard to identify before. And if you've ever had the pleasure of doing coding and programming with children and young people, you'll soon spot the ones that can, you know, within 15 minutes do things which you can't explain. And that gives enormous potential to that identification. But I'll hand over to Susan in case she knows of anything specific.
Yeah, Steve, I'm in a similar boat in terms of specific resources, because I think that often is in alignment with kind of what your curriculum looks like. But I would say, just in terms of best practices, yes, integrating technology where we can helps support differentiated instruction. It helps in sort of setting up different activities for students that aren't necessarily as visible to other students, you know, don't know exactly what everybody else is doing. But I would say another thing is we don't necessarily want to see technology for basic, regularly basic searching or just rote activity. But again, is the software, the platform, whatever it is that you're using, really helping students think about things differently, engage deeply, connect interdisciplinary, in disciplinary ways, things like that. So I don't know how helpful that is.
Thanks.
Do you want me to speak a little bit about the assessment piece?
Yeah, I'll just share a couple of things specific to technology, which I have come across, and then, we'll do the assessments piece and close. So I have seen two specific things. One is a personalized adaptive learning system can go a long way, and educational initiatives, and they have a very interesting tool called MindSpark, which is an adaptive learning system. And I have seen, interestingly, this system cater to both the slow learners as well as the gifted learners. For example, I know students who are in grade 4 who are doing grade 7 and 8 math, right? So there are technologies like that which can help. We've also, in the last couple of months, started taking some baby steps using generative AI technologies like ChatGPT. For example, we are finding that teachers can create quite interesting resources, low floor, high ceiling activities with the support of technologies like this. And for the older and more mature students, with some coaching, it can be a great, it's almost like a gifted peer. If you have access to the right prompts and you realize that these technologies can hallucinate, there are ways to use it. So yeah, so this is a conversation we can have. Perhaps in a few months, we will do an entire session just on how technology can support. But I do think technology will have to be in the service of the larger way we look at these things. So Susan, if you can, briefly talk about assessments, and then we'll, close after that.
Sure, and we could do a whole day just on assessment and sort of what that means. And this is always where I wish our assessment coordinator, Melissa Hinshaw, was with us, because she knows a lot about this. But for us, there's no sort of single assessment that we can point to. But we have mentioned, as Vishnu was saying, sort of above grade level assessment to get at strengths beyond kind of grade level, or sort of what do students know, understand, and what can they do in the context of school learning, sort of that cognitive abilities, getting a better understanding of sort of how students think and reason, and can use that. But there's sort of no single assessment or single number that tells the whole story of our students and what they need, right? So we have to think about what data are we collecting, for what purpose, how are we going to use this information to guide better experiences and that student's growth and development. So I think, we can use classroom-based assessments for understanding where students are in the setting in front of us, and then sort of some of these other standardized assessments to better understand what's happening to our student body as a whole within the context of the school or the system that we're working in. So I think that it's good to think about that, but to also think about different students' experiences and opportunities and how that impacts what we see in test scores and test results. How that gets interpreted. And also there was a question here at the end related sort of around assessment, sort of teacher and parent observations and questionnaires. Teachers and parents know their students well, but they're also coming from different experiences and, references to their school and understanding how to advocate in that system. So when we think about identification, we always are talking with schools and educators about being very cautious about what opportunities are provided, and if we are taking in data from parents and from educators, who has access to that, opportunity to provide that information, who maybe doesn't have as much opportunity to do that, and thinking about sort of the fairness in that process and sort of how we help educators respond to questionnaires, what they know about giftedness and how it's defined in our school.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. We will, I think, do maybe in 2024, early 2024, another session completely on assessments. And I agree with you that the purpose is extremely important, to be clear about why you're doing the assessment. And while teacher and school observations are extremely important because you have a lot of context, more context also means that you could be more biased. So these are things we will need to balance. Steve, would you have any quick comment on
No.
assessments?
No, I think that was a really useful thing for me to hear as well. From a sort of UAE Dubai context, you know, a lot of us, I think, are probably using CAT4, the cognitive abilities test, which is a robust assessment. It's got a huge standardized size, you know, but we also know it's not perfect. And we also know there are barriers, and really consider your EAL children and how they're accessing it, how that might affect their ability to your ability to see their underlying ability, and consistent administration and all those sorts of regular issues that schools come across. The other thing is, find your really good early years practitioners, you know, your early primary school teachers, and your whether it's nursery or whatever it is. Protect them at all costs, because they're absolutely precious. And when you've got really skilled early years practitioners who know their children, in terms of early identification, that is just a key resource, because they see that unfiltered, contaminated, if you like, view on what these kids can do spontaneously, what their innate sort of preferences are, and that information is gold dust. They're a really special bunch, those early years educators, and I would implore schools to utilize that resource.
I think this is a really great insight, and I hadn't thought about it that way, that when children are still raw, unfiltered, and one is more open to, you know, allowing them to do whatever they would like to. I think that's probably the best stage to start catching potential and to get more data points, you know, being consistent in these things. So with that, I think we are drawing to the close. I would request Lippy to share the feedback form, and let's get the feedback. And yeah, thanks for being patient and being here for the full 90 minutes. Yeah, I know there are some more questions, but we're going to save this chat. We're going to write to you. We're going to, you know, engage with you and answer all of your questions.
So I have shared the link to the feedback form on chat. And for others, I have also shared it as a QR code on your screen. It will take less than 10 seconds for you to complete. We request you to please share your feedback here. I hope you are able to access the form. In case there is any difficulty, please call it out.
So Lippy, do we close now, or is there anything else?
We are good, but we have only about 6 responses against 70 plus participants. So I'd request everyone to fill this out before they leave.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe you can even send out the URL in case, you know, some of us are not tech savvy enough to scan. Okay, great.
I'll share.
You shared that as well, I see. Okay, great,
yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much, Steve and Susan, for taking out the time. And it's been a great conversation. We've learned a lot, and we have many more questions. So hope to continue this engagement with schools, especially in UAE, in the Middle East, and maybe other regions as well. And thanks once again, everyone.
Thanks, Vishnu. Thanks, Steve. And thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you,
everyone.
Have a good
Yeah.
evening.
Thank you so
Good.
much.
Thank you
Rest
so
of the
much.
day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a lovely day.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, so I'll leave Kushark. That should be fine. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just ending the meeting now. Thank you.
Okay.